So now we'll go on and we can hear from Mariana how it really is.
Well, I moved into one of the CCRCs that Marilyn was talking about 11 years ago, and have learned over that period of time quite a bit about how CCRCs operate, and because I was interested. I'm a sociologist by background, and moving into a community like that, I couldn't help but observe what people were trying to do, what they were able to do, and what they were not able to do. I'm glad to have had the assignment of talking or thinking about communication, because it made me become more consciously aware of all the various ways in which ESC communicates with residents of the CCRCs. And Marilyn gave you some history, but I don't think she conveyed the enormous cultural shift and emotional shift that took place in the change from what had been extremely paternalistic management when I first came in 11 years ago, and a rather close to the vest approach to information, to this current situation, which is about as open as you can get. And many of the things I would say about how we communicate are things that Marilyn has already mentioned. But the practical level, one of the ways in which this new policy seemed to be implemented was this whole idea that everybody who wanted to communicate with the corporate management should go through the executive director. And that was seen by many people as a kind of restriction, a blockage, as something that was going to cause a problem. And I was one of them, in the sense that because I'd been a resident rep for 4 years, and I had done a lot of work trying to learn something about this field, and I had been involved in our providers organization at the statewide level, I had established personal relationships with almost everybody in senior management. And so I had fired off emails to people on the basis of something that had happened recently, and all of a sudden I realized that wasn't exactly kosher. So Chris and I worked out a modus vivendi where in the case of many things, I didn't have to send it to him first, but I had to put him on the CC list. So he knew what was going on and was in the loop, which was fine with me, and I think had worked pretty well. But if I start, as I say, I could list all these things that we did. One thing Marilyn didn't speak of is publications. We do have a publication called Community Matters. It comes out, is it quarterly or annual? Semi-annual, quarterly. That also contains all the kind of financial information, as well as some information about overall planning or changes in the corporate community. And because we have 5 CCRCs, there's always plenty of stuff to put into Community Matters that people are interested in reading about and knowing about. There's a good deal of communication within the CCRC, and I think that's where most of us, as residents, think of the communication process. It's within the resident, where we live, between ourselves and staff and management there. The fireside chat, for example, which Marilyn mentioned, was started 5 years ago, perhaps, something like that. Certainly hasn't been there since the beginning when I first started. And that involves the managers of every department talking to us about what they've done in the past month and what their plans are for the future. And down to the detail of our security guy telling us how many emergency calls there were and how many of them were really emergencies. So that we hear from each department head and also from the executive director about what they're going on at the moment and so on. And from marketing, we hear about how many vacancies there are, how many apartments are under construction, how many people are on wait lists for larger apartments because those are the more desirable ones, how many people are coming in new for the next month, and so on. Ditto, the skilled nursing facility, we hear about how many of our residents are there on a regular basis, how many are Medicare patients from outside, which is a boon, and the other kinds of practical details of running running the organization, running the facility, running the community. I hate that word facility. I saw they had that on the board up there and today in the you know, that when they had that presentation. And I had been told before that facility was a no-no. We weren't supposed to say that. And the resident council and the committees are another very important way of communicating, and both up and down. People who serve on the committees serve as a conduit for information from people who might not want to get up and speak in a regular meeting, but they can speak to a member of the committee, especially the Food and Dining Committee. That's one of the most important ones, as you must imagine. All of us know that food is a really important aspect of our life in CCRC. And just before I came here, I had an interview with the chair of our Food and Dining Committee at St. Paul's, where I am. And she spoke of how valuable it was that at these food and dining committees, there were staff members present from the dining staff, from the management of the dining room, and from the cook staff, so that they had a way of, when they discussed an issue, getting feedback back and forth in real time, instead of writing memos to somebody and then getting an answer 5 days later and then writing another memo and that sort of thing. So that committee, plus the financial study group, which Marilyn mentioned, benefit a great deal from the presence of staff. Not everybody gets senior staff, as the financial study group does, but they get staff that is relevant to that issue and makes communication a two-way street and works pretty well. I would think that the fact that this has evolved over the last 11 years is part of the story that Ellen was talking about. I think this process is a process, and it is something where, depending on where your community is at the moment, whether you're a provider or a resident, you have to assume it's going to change, and that you hope that it's going to change in the right direction, and it's going to involve more involvement, more engagement, more residents wanting to be involved. And I think that's one aspect of this particular thing. Only a certain number of residents in a CCRC want to be involved, want to be informed, want to take part in committee meetings and so on. We had at one point a president of the Residents' Council who took it as a point of honor that she had never met with the executive director during the 2 years in which she was president of the council. I don't consider that a very positive approach. And in our situation, our executive director meets for Monday lunch, as a rule, every week with the head of the resident council and with other members of the council or other residents who would like to have a chance to talk to him at that point. So all of these committees have become more involved. I mean, the residents have become more involved. And just as a side of this, that I think is a good example, for my sins, I have served on the nominating committee for the Residents' Council for several years. And I didn't intend to do that. And a friend of mine who was on the council, and I told her I hadn't intended to do this again. She said, "Didn't you get the memo? You're a permanent member." I'm not a permanent member. However, this year, we had so much easier a time getting people to run for the council, and ours is an elected council, and so we've had I have a number of concerns about that, and one of the things in our bylaws is that we have to have 1.5 times nominees of positions to be filled. So this year there are 4 positions. We're obligated to get 6 people to run. I had hoped we'd get 8, but we got 7. Which because I'm unhappy about the fact that even though everybody's supposed to be a grown-up and take these things as they come, nevertheless, the people who are not elected do feel rejected by the community, at least in some way. And if I had my druthers this year and our 7 nominees, we'd get 4 elected and 3 appointed for next year, because they're all very good people, and I would love to have them on the council. But I do think the fact that the last 1.5 years or 2 years, maybe 3 years perhaps, that we have had such a well-functioning residence council, and the communication back and forth with the executive director and the staff has gone so well, made people have more respect for the council. When I first came in 11 years ago, I thought, what's that? You know, it's kind of Mickey Mouse, and what can they do, and all of that. And I couldn't imagine why anybody would want to spend the time being on the residence council. And over the last 11 years, that situation has had some ups and it's had some downs, but I think we're on an up now, and I think we're in a cycle where we're going to get more and more people who are really interested in being involved and informing themselves and helping to inform the other members of the community. And that's a cycle that goes up. You know, it's one of those things where it can get better and better and better over time. And the planning committee is just the most recent one, and as Marilyn mentioned, and one of the things about that is that she may not know, is that those minutes get published, the minutes of the planning committee get published, as do all the other committees, on resident bulletin boards where they have easy access to them, and anybody who really wants to know about what's going on can know. And I go back to the concern about sending the messages through the executive director. I had an interesting conversation with him, and one of the things that he pointed out to me, which I hadn't thought of logically before, was that almost all messages from our residents that they want to send to senior management have to do with the operation of our community. That's his job. And if he didn't have access to that kind of information coming from residents, or if senior management took over an issue that had been sent to them directly by a resident, they would be doing his job. And that it's important that he not be cut out, or that he have full responsibility and the respect of the residents, that whatever goes on inside our halls, he's responsible for. And that he should not, that messages perhaps can go on to Walnut Creek where our corporate office is, but they don't necessarily have to go on to Walnut Creek if it's something that he can take care of. And he himself has that approach with his own managers, that if somebody comes to him about towels, he asks them to go to the head of the department that takes care of towels, etc., in terms of all the different issues that come up. I think that one of the things about communication as I started to think about this was the flip side. Both communication, which is giving out information, and communication, which is listening to and responding to information. I think all of us want the providers to be responsive. I think sometimes it's a little hard to get the residents to be responsive, and that they take in the information that they've received and think about it seriously, and not just have it wash over the top of their heads. I think some places it's true that management does not listen to the residents. I've heard that enough from enough people, having come to several of these meetings, that I find that very unfortunate. Those of you who are providers in the room may know who you are, if in fact your management does not listen to the residents. But the other side of that is that I think residents have to listen to what information is available. And some people really don't want to pay much attention. I came here to retire. I didn't come here to be involved in the issues of managing a CCRC. I don't care about the financial study group. I just don't want my rate to go up. And so, you know, it's one of those things that is kind of endemic in our situation. The other thing I think is probably, again, maybe not of interest to everybody, but I feel concerned that the fact about, and I'm sure all the providers are aware of this, many of our residents are frightened by change. And so our life, you know, as citizens, as individuals, as members of families, always involves change. And so does our life in CCRC. And that is where the communication falls down. That's where the fact that, as Ron indicated, when things come along that are new and different, if there hasn't been enough communication as the process evolves, then residents are going to take it badly. They're going to react badly, and especially the people who are the most outspoken about those kinds of issues are going to collect a coterie of people who will support their opposition or their anxiety or their fear or whatever it is. And we have in California a providers organization that has worked very hard to get the kind of legislation that Evelyn spoke of, about representation and so on. And it's called the California Association. It's CalFOR it's CAL, it's K-A-L, and then Continuing Residents Association. So they do not have the same attitude that NACRA has. NACRA has, it's written in its policy thing someplace or other, that they are watchdogs for the industry, watchdogs for the residents and friends of the industry. Well, friends of the industry would not fly with the group that currently runs the Residents Association in California, because they haven't had in the past, and I think quite legitimately, a bad reaction to opposition from providers for types of legislation that they had recommended. And that's another topic, not the topic we're on. But I do think that I resented some of the things that they put out because I felt like they were scaring members of our community who were vulnerable, easily frightened, and you know, it's a little like some of the stuff you hear these days about the deficit. Oh, we're all going to fall off the cliff. But I really felt it was almost a form of elder abuse, the degree to which they were frightening people about what might happen and when it might happen and how it was going to affect you and what was going to happen and so on. But on a more cheerful note, I will tell you a story that I think is funny and shared with management people the other day. Right after we had a very detailed description, as we often do, of new legislation, things that affect residents, that affect CCRCs, we had a very detailed discussion of HIPAA, which, as you know, I think is a health information, privacy protection, something like that. Privacy protection, something, HIPP, portability, whatever. Oh, that's right, you can't port it. And we had this very detailed description, and the next morning in the elevator, one of our longer-term residents was there with a number of us. And as you know, when you get in the elevator, we live in a high-rise, you get in an elevator, people say, "How are you?" She said, "I can't tell you."